Right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to welcome members, officers, and members of the public watching at home to this Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. This committee plays an important role in the overall governance of the Council. Good governance has many benefits, including helping the Council to make effective decisions, improve performance, and be able to respond to risks and opportunities. Can I invite the committee member and scrutiny manager to explain how proceedings will work?
Thank you, Chair. So if a member wishes to speak, they should use the speak button located on the microphone unit in front of you. Please wait for the Chair's invitation to speak before you begin, at which point your microphone will be made red and you can speak. When requested to vote, voting will be via the yes, no, abstain buttons on your microphone unit. Details of how members voted will be shown on the screens around the room, and the result will be visible on the YouTube stream. In the event of any tied vote, the Chair will have the casting vote. Are there any questions before we proceed with tonight's meeting? Great. I'll hand back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. So, apologies for absence. We've received apologies from Councillors Paul Ward and Stephen Patmore. Having given due notice, Councillor Caroline McDonnell will be substituting for Councillor Ward, and Councillor Ralph Munzer will be substituting for Councillor Patmore. Are there any further apologies? I don't think there is anything else, is there? Brilliant. Item 2, minutes 13th of November 2024. I'd like to propose that we take as read and approve as a true record the minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of November 2024. Could I please have a seconder? Councillor Willoughby, thank you. Does anyone have any comments on the minutes? Brilliant. In which case, we can go to the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. That motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Item 3, notification of other business. No other business has been notified. Chair's announcements. In accordance with Council policy, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be available both on the Council's YouTube channel as well as the Council's ModGov site alongside the documents from this meeting. Members are reminded to make declarations of interest before an item. The detailed reminder about this and speaking rights is set out under Chair's announcements on the agenda. For the purpose of clarification, 4.8.23a of the Constitution does not apply to this meeting. Therefore, a member may leave the room during the debate and consideration of that item and will be able to vote. However, please be mindful of the business on the agenda and, wherever possible, leave an appropriate point in the proceedings. Public participation. We have no public participation this evening. So we'll move on to item 6, internal audit report, review of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. Hand over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. We generally have every year or so a review by SIAS, our Shared Internal Audit Service, of the effectiveness of the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee. They generally will talk to members of the committee. I think they spoke to probably 2 members of the committee this time, partly because of the kind of large turnover of committee members between the last set of elections. So we have a lot of new members. So they spoke to 2 kind of ones that have been here both years. So they had the input from that, as well as talking to officers who kind of interact with the committee as well, including Chris Wood from Internal Audit. So the audit itself was done by their audit partner rather than SIAS themselves, but they then spoke to Chris Woods as kind of a contributor to the audit, as well as committee services as well, and myself, to sort of get a sense about how well the committee was functioning, as well as watching some of the videos of the proceedings on YouTube as well. They have come up in, I'm going to refer to the appendix and page 24 of the report pack, some recommendations around improving the effectiveness of the committee. So I'll briefly run through those. In general, there's probably an opportunity for members of the committee to comment on these. And some of the comments here just say let's talk about the committee, because it's down to you as to how much you want to interact in these ones. So looking at number 1 is the annual self-assessment exercise. We use this every year. Being completely honest, it wasn't particularly well completed. Happy to go back to doing it again. It is good practice around every year, just getting you to sort of all have a sense about what your skills are, and then looking at skills gaps, and then we can use then the training that comes out of that to kind of think about what areas to focus on. So yeah, a commitment to do that would be great, and then we can then sort of reintroduce that for the next sort of civic year, and then look at the training based on that. But it does obviously require you as members of the committee to complete those returns to make sure we're focusing on training in the right places. Number 2, the first bit is around the fact that the Finance Audit Risk Committee still has finance reports going to it, and the best practice would say that that's probably not the best approach, albeit it has until now been a fairly pragmatic approach. It's not within FAR's gift itself to determine what should come to it as a committee. It can have a view on it, but it's part of any constitution review around where a report should sit in terms of the overall structure of the committees of the council. So therefore, as it was also raised as part of the peer review, we've kind of put a long date on that to kind of consider that as part of the peer review response as well, giving them a similar recommendation. In terms of the second part of that, it's highlighting that members of the committee have the opportunity to talk to both our external auditor and the head of internal audit if they wish to. I think the conclusion was none of you have exercised that right, which might be completely logical. But I guess just to remind you, you can exercise that right. And if you need help kind of being pointed in the right direction in that regard, feel free to contact me and I'll help you kind of make those contacts. So yeah, just kind of making that point that that option is available, and that doesn't have to be a particular point of concern. It could be a general conversation with those particular individuals to kind of sort of see where they're going and what their kind of focuses on. In terms of the next part of that particular one, there was a recommendation around risk reports having better summaries on them. So I've tried that as part of the risk report you'll see later this evening. Obviously come back to me after we've discussed that item, probably as part of that item, to tell me, is that landing right in terms of what you need as a committee? It can be more detailed or less detailed or whatever you want. So maybe park that until we come to that item, sort of comment on that one there. Under the third point, I guess just general highlight about importance of training. It links back to the same point around kind of the skills assessment is be put on training. Please come to it whenever you can. So just a point there around if you can make it, please come to training. We've obviously moved to the train before each FAR meeting as kind of a way of hopefully making it as accessible as we can. But if that doesn't work for people, can look at kind of revisiting other ways of doing training, including kind of, I guess, another evening out of your diary or during the day, or looking at e-learning as well. So there's various options you can look at if there's better ways of accessing training. And then I guess 4 is the same in terms of looking at making sure that the training is addressing the relevant points and always getting that feedback coming in. So yeah, so any kind of points, any of those would be helpful in terms of how we respond to this, to sort of further respond. We've done the response back in terms of the audit report, and that will be kind of noted and monitored against that kind of audit. But obviously, anything more we can do to that to kind of be better as a committee will be very, very, very beneficial.
Thank you very much, Ian. Are there any questions to the committee? Ruth, Councillor Brown, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. And thank you for the training that you delivered just before the meeting tonight. And I've attended a few of those, but I think it is quite an awkward time for a lot of people. And I've found those brief 30-minute trainings quite helpful. I just wondered if there was any scope. You did sort of mention it to record those and put them on Grow Zone so that people could then watch them in their own time. Would that be possible?
I'm sure it would be if I get trained in terms of how to record stuff and put it onto, do it appropriately. I'm sure it's possible, yes.
And then secondly, I just wanted to ask about this meeting with the external auditors and head of internal audit at least once a year. Would there be any value? I mean, I know you've said we can ask for it, but would there be any value in scheduling a meeting once a year for the whole of the committee to meet with those people, so that it's in the diary and as many people as possible actually can do it. Because I'm not going to remember to ask. I'm just saying, if it was in the diary, I would probably turn up. So is that possible to schedule something?
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, I think the next meeting we've got, the next training scheduled is Chris Wood, the internal audit manager, training on global internal audit standards. And I'm sure we could use that thing as both a bit of training and also a chance to kind of have that meeting in the same thing. And equally, I'm sure at some point when our external auditors are presenting to you, we could ask them if they could come along a bit early. Again, sort of using that training time, if that would work. Or it doesn't have to be quite as early as kind of quarter to 7. Then it could be a bit later in terms of then that kind of meeting happening at that sort of time. That would certainly work well. But we could look at a time, another time. Probably don't have to be doing a day, but then that could be over Zoom or Teams, or use one of those sort of technologies as a way to do it, if that made it more accessible.
Councillor Poopersingham.
Thanks, Chair. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the recommendation about establishing an audit committee specifically. How would that, just so I'm really clear in my own mind, how would that potentially shift the role of what we're doing presently? What would the additional benefit of that separate audit committee be?
So you are the audit committee. The issue at the moment is that you get finance reports. So you get the reports on the revenue monitor, the capital monitor, and to an extent the budget setting reports as well, are all finance reports rather than kind of governance reports. Whilst we try and frame those in terms you're not making decisions on them, and you are there to kind of hopefully provide some critical advice to cabinet on those. The idea would be that you don't touch those. They would then sit with either overview and scrutiny or a separate kind of finance scrutiny committee would be the ideal. But the issue with that is just another meeting in the calendar, another set of councils to find, etc., etc. So we have thus far said that actually we try and make sure the focus of you're looking at those reports is the right one, but it is to a degree a bit of, in governance terms, you are too involved, and therefore you're marking your own homework in terms of that governance perspective on it, and that it'd be better for there to be a separate committee looking at it, and then you look at the governance side of it and go, is that committee doing a good job in supporting cabinet in looking at that? So it's pragmatism versus idealism.
Councillor Munster.
Thank you. I note that this report was prepared in December 2024. Of course, we had the corporate peer challenge taking place at a very, very similar time. And whilst that didn't necessarily look in as much detail into the role of FAR and audit, are there any trends of which we've identified from both the corporate peer challenge and then sort of flowing through into this?
So the main ones I've highlighted as a reflection in the report is around that role of this committee in terms of those finance reports. But the draft, the report from the corporate peer challenge did also make some recommendations in relation to risk. And there probably is some overlap there in terms of that, making sure the reporting to this committee is helping you to have that good governance in relation to risk. It's, I think the peer challenge report went a bit further in terms of approach to risk and that kind of thing. This doesn't do, but there's definitely something in there around that theme around how you as a committee have that good governance over risk and what we're doing in relation to risk.
Any further questions in the committee? John Cannon.
You did just one on the training piece. It's difficult, I think, to find fresh ground for doing the training. And I think we're on a bit of a cycle, which is fine by my standards, but maybe there's an explanation in there as to why the training is partially attended. So I didn't know that the training was minuted. I was interested to see that referenced in the report. So if you can clarify for me, please, is the training mandatory? And if so, then obviously that might encourage participation. But equally, if we're in a cycle of repeating topics, then we're turning up for the sake of it.
Yeah, the training is not mandatory. We very strongly encourage kind of every councillor to attend this kind of finance and risk training at the start of each civic year. But the training from this committee is not currently mandatory. It is best practice is referring to, rather than sort of saying it's something you have to do, but saying that, you know, if you want to be a really effective committee, being well trained is part of that. I guess for you in particular, and the chair, you have been round this loop a few times now in terms of the training cycle, but we obviously have got a kind of a new cohort of members for this year as well who probably haven't gone through that loop. So it's always going to be a balance around how we keep it interesting for those that have been around that cycle before, but also kind of making it accessible to those who are newer. And there will come a point where some people just don't need to turn up to training because it is just going to be the same training again. And I guess the self-assessment bit will come into that, is around, we will target the training at those areas that need the most, but that could be because a group of 4 or 5 councillors really need the training at a kind of medium level, and if there are some that already at that level, there's no point in going to that training.
Thank you. Any further questions? If not, the recommendation is that the committee comment on and note the internal audit report as attached at Appendix A. Could I please have a proposer? Councillor Pooper-Singham, thank you. And a seconder. Councillor Brown, thank you very much. We'll move on to the debate now. Any debate from members of the committee at all? I suppose I'll just add something quickly on from some recent training I attended, which was audit. It was a joint training committee between overview and scrutiny and audit chairs. And it was quite specific in that most other chairs who were attending were purely audit, rather than, in my case, having the finance and risk side attached as well. The takeaway I had from that is that committees of that nature are very governance focused, purely governance focused, looking at things like we've had recently, that come through this committee, the changes to the procurement rules that were looked at, reviewed. That essentially becomes a role of that committee to look at the nature of the governance of how the council runs itself, obviously not doing the same overview and scrutiny role in terms of looking back at decisions, but essentially, I suppose, almost preparing the rules and setting them out and understanding their viability and how well set out they are. I suppose in terms of the best practice element, I find it quite useful getting that bit as well as the finance reports through, and understanding sort of broader view of the committee, of what the council does, and having that ability to comment on both. But I mean, again, I suppose it's more for the output of those other reviews underway, and the views of leadership in terms of both the officers and the political side in terms of what the council looks like going forward. But I think from my perspective, all I'd add on that really is that I find it quite useful having both sides come in, as well as the risk side included, in terms of a broader understanding. I think it sometimes helps in terms of being able to review those reports and kind of comprehend where they're coming from and what effect they might have. Yeah, I think other than that, the only other thing I'll say on the training is that it's very welcome to have the training that we do have. I think today's the first time where I've seen, I think, similar slides from 2 years ago come up again in terms of the activities Ian has set for us to consider. But again, we are a very new committee in terms of membership, so covering ground again, and it's been 2 years since I've seen that myself, so refreshers are never a bad thing either. I think in terms of the comments on when we have the training, that's probably something we need to look at in terms of making sure it's accessible as widely as possible. And if it can be put online, I think that's probably a good intermediate step in terms of making sure we can have the in-person stuff if needed. But again, if people can't make it, then it's available there. Councillor Willoughby.
Thank you, Chair. One thing I would suggest is that most of us who are on this committee are not looking at these items on a daily basis. We come to them when we read the papers in advance. So I think anything that gives us an opportunity to as a refresher or to give us additional information is to be very much welcomed.
Councillor Brown.
Just to add something to the debate around this committee, it was identified in the previous corporate peer review, which I think was in 2019 or 20. It was not long after I got elected, that this committee is essentially a finance scrutiny committee as well as an audit and risk governance, and as Ian has laid out. And whilst in some ways it works, it is an outlier in terms of other councils don't do it like this. And I think as the previous administration, we looked at it a number of times and it got to the point where we were coming up against the all-up elections and felt it would be better to wait for the next administration. But depending on the report that comes from the latest challenge, I think if it comes up again, then it does need seriously looking at. I know that there has been some debate in the constitutional review around it, and what to do with the standards committee as well. But I think we should at least have a proper discussion or a working group or however you want to do it, to look at this, because if it's been identified twice and we are an outlier, then we should be thinking. The thing about marking your own homework worries me somewhat. But I too, like you say, Chair, it's interesting to have the finance as well as the governance issues in the one committee. I do find that interesting, and I also understand the pragmatism around another committee, another set of councillors, another set of clerking and committee services staff out for another evening is a bit of an issue as well.
Yeah, no, I do agree on that point about the fact that if it keeps coming up in reviews, then it's probably something to be reviewed and looked at properly in depth. What the outcome is, obviously, we'll have to wait and see. But I think that is if you're asking for the reviews to take place and for experts to come in and look at structures and they keep bringing up the same points, then there probably is something there to be considered. So yeah, I do agree on that. Any further points? Oh yeah, John Cannon, sorry.
Thanks. I'd be interested to the extent the data is available on amongst whom are North Hart's an outlier. If we need to compare like with like, I would suggest if we're going to compare ourselves to metropolitans, London boroughs, where there's bigger money, more going on, higher risks, I can understand that the distinction between audit and governance for the committees would be easier to make. But in a smaller organisation like this, it does seem efficient to adopt the model that's in place at the moment. And I think if we strip out some of the risk pieces and so on, you'd actually have a very small audit committee. And maybe that's the name of the game, but the committee meetings could be short to the point of glib. And there needs to be enough meat on the plate to make it worthwhile and have a meaningful committee. So it's finely balanced. Did you have a sense of who we are outliers amongst?
I'm being quite honest. We got broken out in small groups at one point. I ended up here with the audit chair from Birmingham, which obviously is a probably unfair comparison on many fronts, particularly to Mr. Cooper, as well as a couple. There was one district council, but from Essex, that was quite a large one, and there was another one from the southern region, which again was a borough council rather than district. So again, in terms of the detailed bits I did, they were quite different organisations. But out of the full attendees, I think there were about 20 audit chairs attending. I think I was alongside one other who had a different set of responsibilities in that sense. So, again, it's a small pool out of the 300 or so councils that exist. But on the day, it definitely felt that there was even then I was still a bit of in a different situation. But again, I think the point about scaling is probably fair as well. And it's, again, I suppose part of that review is going to be that consideration of what makes sense. And, like you say, if there's enough business then across those different sections to be considered. Ian, I don't know if you had something to add there.
Yeah. So following the last the last peer review, the one before this one, I did have a look at both other Hertfordshire authorities, so the districts in Hertfordshire, as well as what sit with them and nearest neighbours, so those authorities that are in kind of demographic terms and other terms similar to us, and we are an outlier against those. Albeit what I would say is that looking at them, what they do in relation to their finance reports is very mixed in terms of, do they look at them at all? So it's any committee looking at them before they go to cabinet. In some cases, there was no real evidence they were. So I guess that reflects that they've taken the ideal approach in terms of what the audit committee should be doing, but then ended up with actually, if a more of a scrutiny committee is supposed to be looking at those reports, it's not happening very frequently. So there is that dilemma there around actually making sure you achieve something that is then still meaningful in terms of someone looking at those reports to give that oversight, whilst also avoiding the marking your own homework approach. So it's always a difficult balance where you are looking at district level authorities where there are limited capacity to have kind of meetings and the impact of those.
Councillor Munster.
Thank you. I just want to elaborate a little bit on Councillor Brown's point, because she and I, of course, are both group leaders, and this is the structure and the potential constitutional changes surrounding finance, audit and risk is something that has been discussed at the Constitutional and Governance Working Group. And we certainly have had some scoping discussions about potentially what the future looks like and how we can enable better financial scrutiny. Certainly, what seems to be a trend both from the internal audit reports and the corporate peer challenges that, these matters continue to be raised in these reports. And certainly when we get the full corporate peer challenge, the re-emphasis, I would submit, to go and do something about this is going to be very, very high on the agenda. But it's very important that we don't rush into anything and that we take our time with it in order to ensure that we actually get the best possible outcome, which will deliver the best possible scrutiny. And that's certainly working amongst overview and scrutiny. It's working with this committee, it's working with our officers and group leaders and cabinet as well, to ensure that we're having a really holistic approach and one that is going to be the most effective. But that's all I'll say on that.
Thank you. Any further debate at all from the committee? If not, can we please move to the vote?
Thank you, Chair. That motion's carried unanimously.
Thank you very much. Now move on to item 7, which is the revenue and capital budgets for 2025-26 onwards. I'll hand over again to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. With the last item in mind, I will start with the recommendations. Obviously, you'll note that under the top recommendations, you do sort of say that for comments on the recommendations to Cabinet, which are, I guess it's a case of where we're trying to avoid the perception that you are marking your homework, is around that approach to commenting on and reviewing, is looking at the robustness of the process and the robustness of the estimates and those kind of things, rather than the policy decisions that we're looking at there. So not a case of looking at should we make savings on X, Y, or Z, which is obviously in the report in terms of the appendices. That's both the role of Cabinet and the role of Council. As an audit committee, as a finance audit and risk committee, and sort of trying to make sure that finance element is taking the right approach, it is that different view of the world in terms of, is the process there right? Is that effective? And so taking that approach to the report. So I'll briefly run through the report, what the report says, but kind of looking at that lens is probably quite important. So in terms of the content of the report, this describes what is currently our standard approach to budget setting. It starts off with officers and then combined with exec members looking at proposals, both in terms of savings, i.e. reductions in spend or increased income, and investments, increased in spend or reductions in income, and the impact of those, and then collating those into one thing. That is then discussed at 2 meetings of the budget workshops, one for the administration and one for the opposition groups. This year we did the opposition groups essentially complete together. In previous years they have been separated out when we have had kind of 2 opposition groups rather than the joint administration we have for quite some time. And then that it feeds into Cabinet in this report to consider what to take forward into the final budget report, which then goes through the process in February. So this takes the feedback from that budget workshop and that process and provides that feedback back to Cabinet. And then when Cabinet looks at it next week, it'll be down to them to decide actually which of those items we want to take forward to the next stage, bearing in mind the feedback from the budget workshops. It also covers in the report where we're up to with our funding. So since the budget workshops, we've had a policy statement from government in relation to local government funding, and then we've had the provisional local government settlements, both pretty much aligned in terms of what we're expecting. So the focus is on not us in terms of authorities to give any more money to. It's on social care, it's on areas of deprivation, which is not us. So in terms of core spending power, the focus is on those, and therefore we're seeing a 0% increase in our core spending power. What we have got, and I've notes throughout the report, I've got my acronyms a bit erratic. So it should be EPR throughout, Extended Reduced Responsibility, rather than there are some references to ERP, which is a different acronym completely. So in terms of that, that is guaranteed additional funding for 1 year only. Which is positive in terms of reducing the core now reserves in that year, but noting there is no guarantees around how it retreats in future years. So an unknown there in terms of future funding. And that is, I guess, because we're in a 1 year settlement still until we get to the kind of the multi-year settlement, which should be proposed for next year. And then we'll get a better idea about where the direction of travel is going in relation to that. I guess I would note that there is definitely some new burdens funding due in relation to provision of food waste collections, and also I would expect some additional new burdens funding in relation to the requirement to collect fibre separately from other recyclable materials, which has come out of the kind of simpler recycling kind of mantra and guidance and regulations. So you could say that funding may suddenly be switched to provide that new burdens funding in some form, albeit a different set of equations to achieve that. But that's just speculation. That's not been confirmed at any point. That could be additional funding completely, and this could carry on, and we'd be quite nicely off in relatively compared to where we might have been. But who knows at this stage? So yeah, in terms of risk terms, we just don't know in terms of how funding's going. We know it's for next year now. That will be a lower call on reserves than what we are projecting, albeit the direction of travel could be a worse than we're projecting, because we've clearly seen that for next year, excluding the EPR, there is no growth in our core spending power. And if that was to continue, that is a lower ongoing trajectory than what we were forecasting previously, where we were looking at below inflation, but some increase in our core spending power. So taking that into account, Cabinet are asked to consider what proposals to take on next year in terms of the budget, noting that the net impact of those is significantly higher in terms of cost terms than the kind of proposal set out in the medium-term finance strategy, which should be aiming for a net nil increase budget for the coming year. There's good reason for that, particularly in some cases in terms of pressures on various teams and managing those pressures to deliver statutory services. But you know, we have got to consider overall, particularly with a governance hat on, you know, how do we balance kind of the spend pressures with a sensible risk-based approach to setting the budget.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. Move on to questions now. Start with you, Councillor Brown.
Chair, I wasn't going to ask this, but I will now. That new burdens funding for food waste collections, we are actually going to receive that. Are you confident of that? Because obviously we're unlike East Hearts who don't do it at the moment. We actually already do it, and it wasn't clear whether we were going to get it. But are you saying you're confident we will now?
The commitment has always been that all authorities will get new burdens funding, rates to be determined, for the ongoing costs of food waste collection. The differentiation is for the additional capital funding up front, for authorities that have not already implemented it. So yes, I'm expecting, and I hope not to be proved wrong, that we would get some new burdens funding for food waste, from the point that it is statutorily required rather than just our choice to provide it.
Thank you. So we'll probably get less than East Hearts, but at least we'll get something. So I just wanted to ask about, so on 8.2, you say there was no formal feedback from either of the opposition groups. I'm aware that Ian, you wrote to the opposition group leaders and asked for formal feedback. I'm talking about Ian Cooper here. We said that we wanted to wait until the cabinet had got definite proposals. So I just wanted to put that on record that we are planning some formal feedback. And we have been in touch with you about that, but that we haven't done it prior to this meeting. So I just felt that was important to say. And then I just wanted to ask about 8.7, the increased national insurance contributions, that we were expecting some additional funding from government for salaried staff, but not contracted out. Has this been quantified, how much this might cost for our contracted out services, or you're not in a position to do that yet?
It's complicated, in that it's not always a contractual requirement that is picked up. A lot of our contracts are linked to salary, percentage increase in salary overall rather than the national insurance side of it. So we're still sort of negotiating what it looks like. In relation to our waste contract, we have got a kind of a pay true-up mechanism to be implemented as part of the start of the new contract. So it will come out through that as to what the impact is going to be when we do that, albeit we haven't done it yet because there's still lots of other things going on that are taking the attention of both the waste team and our new contractor, rather than looking at the detail of the finances just yet, although I will try and get an estimate in time for the budget. But when we looked in broad terms at the overall impact of the waste contract with the additional capital we put in last year, it is looking like broadly it'll be about right, albeit the national insurance stuff has to feed through into that. In terms of the funding we may get, that will be confirmed as part of the final settlement. The overall pot is too small. Every council that I know that has done analysis has looked at the total pot and gone, our share of that might be X and that is too small. There is also concern that the methodology is wrong, and that will favour some councils over other councils. So the proposal is that the methodology would split it based on overall spend rather than on overall pay spend. Overall spend will take into account contracted services. So we would then, I guess, relatively benefit from that in that we are a council that has a fairly high number or value of contracted out services compared to some. But I know that those that, given it's supposed to be focused on just on pay costs directly employed, will petition against that and say your methodology is wrong, as well as saying the overall pot's too small as well. So I don't want to commit either way on that in terms of know it until I know what the number's going to be. But it's just a case of waiting and see what number that number comes out at in terms of how big the impact of that will be. And we'll continue to talk to our contractors around, what are we required to pay in terms of that, and then what do we need to negotiate to pay, just be sort of where there's kind of change control parameters in the contracts. So it's still an ongoing discussion to be had to sort of work out what the impact that's going to be.
Councillor Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. On 8.9, I appreciate it kind of explains it in 8.11, but just so I'm clear, it says that the business rates reset mean that we lose the current additional funding that we get from that, although not part of our current ongoing budget assumptions. Do you know how much current additional funding we will lose due to the business rates reset?
So it varies. When we're part of a business rate pool, we get to keep more of the additional funding above that baseline level than if we're not part of a business rate pool. So we've had a number of years now being part of business rate pools, and that has yielded numbers in the hundreds of thousands pounds increases. I think it's in the essence we sort of almost up to sort of £1 million increase above, and we put that into a reserve and then release that to kind of support our budgets going forward. We won't be part of a pool next year. We weren't part of the chosen group, and therefore that again will be less, probably a few 100,000 difference, and that is the amount we will lose. That kind of extra bonus we've been getting that we've never budgeted on. We just budgeted on the baseline level, but that has been a kind of an ongoing extra above that baseline level, and to get that back again requires business growth in business rates back above the new level it's been reset at, and whether that's feasible or possible is probably unlikely, particularly in the short term.
Councillor Munter.
Thank you. Could I just focus on reserves and specifically sort of, using our reserves in order to supplement our core spending power? In budgetary terms and percentage terms, what is the proposal for this budget in the coming financial year, and how does that compare to other local authorities of a comparable size and scale?
So it will depend on the final estimates. So we're looking at probably around about, in the coming year, £2 to £2.5 million calling reserves, and that'll be a combination of business rates reserve, retained business rates, and the general fund reserve, with most of it coming out of the business rate reserve in the coming year. Although that will now be a bit lower because we've got the EPR money coming in, which will provide a nice kind of bonus, I guess, in terms of that calling reserves in the coming year, because it's on ring fence, we can do that. So that's the calling reserves in the coming year. In percentage terms, and that's around about sort of, I guess, sort of just under 10% of our net budget. But it's obviously not the same in the long term. How that compares to others, we are fortuitous, good management of our budgets over many years, however you want to look at it, in having a high level of general fund reserves. That also partly comes down to how we plan our budgets and making sure we are not overly exposed in terms of our budget assumptions. So in that regard, we have got capacity to do that out of reserves compared to other authorities which have no general fund reserves or nothing above the minimum level, and therefore they will have the budgets to balance in year. It is a legitimate approach in terms of a balanced budget to do it over the medium term, and therefore you can use reserves in a managed way. So it is a reasonable approach to take. It is, I guess, a council decision as to the extent to which to use up those reserves to balance the budget versus trying to achieve a balanced budget more quickly and then either keeping those reserves there or using those to a degree for a one-off purpose, which could be an exceptional investment in something. Or the other approach is just to kind of keep dwindling them slowly to balance the budget in year. There are various approaches that can be adopted. Obviously, at the extreme end, if it gets to the point where there's, in the medium term, I can't see a way that the council can balance his budget and is sort of sleepwalking into disaster, that's when I start banging the drum and issuing warnings around the impending reports like Section 104 reports. We are nowhere near there yet, but just saying that is kind of the place you could end up at eventually, but because we've got those high level reserves, it is a long way off. But there is those decisions around to what extent you want to manage those reserves to kind of achieve the balanced budget and over what time period.
Can I just come back on that? Is that all right? Obviously, this is what's going on in the short term. In your opinion, in the medium to long term, is this current model that we are pursuing sustainable?
Yes. Well, so it's not sustainable if we carry on doing what we're doing. We have to make changes, and that's what the MTFS has said, and the budget reports said for quite some time, is that there is a point where you need to start making big savings. The earlier you do that, the better in terms of sustaining those reserves and giving you capacity to do more and more things, particularly noting that as you do more and more risky things, i.e. big projects like Churchgate, like decarbonisation, those add to your risk to your projects, and therefore they add to your minimum general fund balance. I'll come back to you probably, maybe not for next year, but maybe for the year after, and say, previously our minimum level of general fund reserve has been about, say, 3 million. Actually, now I'm going to say to you, actually, maybe it's 3.5 or 4 million because we've got a high level of risk and a potential high level of exposure, and therefore need to manage that lower limit a bit higher. So yes, action will need to be taken to get our budgets to a balance. It is not urgent action at this stage, but there is action that needs to be taken to balance the budget in the medium term. And there will be variations about how we achieve that over that cycle.
And could I just hone in on one of the points that you made surrounding public sector decarbonisation? Obviously, we discussed it at length last night at ONS, and there are significant financial risks to the council regarding the path that Cabinet chooses on the 15th of January to go down. Will you be able to give us an assurance that whatever decision Cabinet makes, that will be factored into the budget papers of which are presented to council in late February?
Yes, all known projections will feature in that budget. There's always stuff that we don't know about, or I know may be happening that will not feature in those projections, but then that will be clearly spelled out in terms of the risks in that budget, and therefore will get again potentially feature in that kind of recommended minimum balance of the general fund, because that's their protection against risks. The more unknown risks we've got, as is referenced in that report, is going to Cabinet next week. If one of the options is taken, which has a high financial impact on an ongoing basis, proposal in there is potentially refer that on to council immediately. That decision to be taken by council rather than Cabinet, given the ongoing budget implications and the risk that you then have a Cabinet decision then contradicts what might then happen as part of the budget setting process, which was obviously want to avoid. That's in no one's interest. So that could be one scenario, albeit there are other options that could be taken by Cabinet next week that would not require that to take place.
Councillor Albert.
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian set out the issues really well here. I think it's completely the right question that you asked, Ralph, and hopefully those answers are reassuring. Clearly, 8.7 sets out both where we are on reserves, which are relatively healthy at the moment, but clearly that the difficult choices that still lie ahead over the medium-term financial strategy period, as we set out in that report, and obviously how we would look to work together, kind of cross-party. We've already had one meeting about that consultation that we would need to do next summer, and we'll be looking to hold a further meeting in the near future around that future sort of consultation with residents. I mean, it must be said, and I appreciate this is something Ian probably can't say, but clearly the previous government, and you'll remember, Ralph, what Michael Gove used to say to us, that he said that councils like us held too much reserves and we should be spending those reserves. And I guess that's kind of what we're forced into the position of doing. I absolutely think, as Ian set out earlier on, whilst there has been, and I think we've welcomed some of the things that the new government has done, but I think there are still big challenges for all local authorities of all different parties and different party political controlled here. This is not a party political issue in my in my view, I think it's the challenge for the whole of the local authority sector around the size of the pot, the services that we're expected to deliver, and of course here clearly that one of the issues that that we're not able to fully reflect, obviously, in these papers this evening, but it is the elephant in the room. We don't know yet where we're likely to be going on devolution. That in reality, it is more than possible that this council will not exist at the end of the medium-term financial strategy period. None of us know where we are going to be on that. So whilst I am absolutely not suggesting that on that basis we don't need to try and balance our books, the finance director would clearly be remonstrating with us if that was the case. But obviously there is that additional level of uncertainty about the future. But that still leaves us, I think, and the importance still of whatever local authority exists that is the governance for this area in the future, or local authorities, whatever that might be. It's still important that obviously councils, are able to provide the key services, balance their books, and run as efficiently as possible. And we need to do that, even if we don't think that we might not be here in 3 years' time or 5 years' time. We've still got to do this really important job, because we can't just leave it to someone else and say, oh well, we won't be here, but someone else will pick up this problem in a 2 or 3 years' time or 4 years' time. So that's just not acceptable in my view. So the challenges, I think, are well set out in 8.7, and hopefully Ian's provided you, Ralph, with, I think, some of the assurances that we want to do.
Thank you, Ian. Are there any further questions at all? John Cannon.
Thanks, Chair. Just following the point that Ian made about the future of the authority and devolution and so on. I'll try and phrase the question around process, given the context that was set at the start of the meeting. So it's more about that than policy. But it struck me that the proposals set out in these tables don't present a prioritized view of them. It's a list of things, but I wondered, does the prioritization come at Cabinet, or are we missing an opportunity to refine the list, to sequence these into the things that the council must do and those that it would like to do at this early stage?
That's a good question. Yes, I think there probably is. The list is generally treated as which of these do you want to take forward, Cabinet, and therefore Cabinet could then choose from that list which ones to take forward. Do all of them? Do take some of them out if they want to? And this is, I guess, down to Cabinet as part of that to consider the relative priorities of them. Obviously, Cabinet have the advantage of the representatives that are there are the executive members who will know the services and will talk to service directors of those areas in lots of detail to make sure that they are happy with what's being proposed. But yes, there probably is a lack of, I guess, for this group in terms of in your kind of, I guess, overview role of that in terms of what the relative priorities are of those. But equally for members other than yourself, John, there was a budget workshop process, and the whole point of that is to be able to ask questions around why we're doing that, and we dig into a lot of detail around challenging that. Whether it operates effectively on that basis would be another consideration, but that is what the purpose of that thing is for, is to get that challenge, to get those comments, and then to provide that feedback. There's definitely a good emphasis when sitting in the meetings on the question side of it, but obviously there hasn't really been much in terms of coming out of that in terms of saying what the relative priorities are and the feedback bit of it to Cabinet. Albeit the Cabinet sit through the administration workshop, will know what's discussed there, but won't potentially get the opposition group feedback, which is their choice in terms of the way they approach it. And they're obviously going to provide feedback at a later date for a different process. but it's not there at this stage.
Thank you. And just to check, Councillor Albert, are you responding to that point directly? Okay, we'll go for you next if possible. I'll come to you, Councillor Monser, afterwards.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, John, you make a good point, and I think is an issue for the cabinet need to discuss at its next meeting, and clearly a further meeting, because there's two iterations of this process that for cabinet to look at. I think I would say, and I do take Ruth's point, that Liberal Democrat colleagues are going to provide some feedback, but for me, I still think it was disappointing, and that actually neither the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives chose to provide any feedback from their budget workshop meetings. Certainly, that's what Labour used to do when we were in opposition. We did provide that feedback. That was something we thought was right to do then, and not to, we'll come back to you later on when you've decided, no, after you. No, after you. And I do think there's an issue. I think that's disappointing, but I welcome the fact that you are going to provide that feedback, hopefully after the cabinet meets next week, and you will provide that further feedback. But I think 8.4 sets out the kind of issue that cabinet will need to debate. We know the issues around housing and environmental health. There are real challenges in that area, and there is a choice there, I think, for cabinet about actually trying to look at what is the priorities there, but also whether we take actually all of those investment proposals forward that the service director has made, or we should really narrow in onto those things around purely statutory services. And that clearly is quite a significant difference in cost terms. I think we'd all like, in an ideal world, to do all of those things, because clearly all of these roles, I think, are really important. But some of them are statutory services, and clearly some of them are not. And that, I think, is the choices there for cabinet in looking at its priorities next week and next month as we come to the budget meeting. And I think 8.4 sets out that challenge, I think, really rather well.
Thank you. Councillor Munster.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a question with respect to prioritisation, but if I just may address the point which Councillor Albert raises. We did, in fact, provide informal feedback at the budget session. Certainly the view of the Conservative group, and I can't speak on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, but our view is that it is the Labour administration's role to propose and present the budget. And when the administration, when cabinet has taken the decision as to the steps of which they wish to proceed with, we will then review that, and we will provide formal feedback and or proposals contrary to that, potentially. And I know Councillor Abbott, I'm sure, is on tenterhooks to hear my budget speech. I'm afraid he's going to have to wait for late February. But if I may just touch upon the prioritisation, because I think there are an awful lot of proposals of which are set out in the revenue budget savings and investments, and specifically focused on the investments. What it may be useful for, either for cabinet colleagues, who I acknowledge completely are fully aware of the issues of which are going on within their directorates, but certainly for councillors at full council, it would be very good to better understand the priority that service directors place on the specific bids of which they are putting in for. Whether a bid is a high priority within that directorate, a medium priority, or a low priority. Is there any scope for service directors to review these budget proposals and attach a prioritisation level to them, so that when we are debating them at council, we have a far better understanding of what the service directors are requesting? In addition to that, is there the possibility to make a identification as to whether this revenue investment proposal goes to statutory or non-statutory services?
we can certainly do this, the latter part of that in terms of statutory versus non-statutory, and we could certainly look at potentially having something around a brief commentary around the implications of not doing it. I think asking service directors to prioritise risks it becoming somewhat arbitrary in terms of just attaching numbers and saying, well, actually, no, that was a 4 rather than a 3 in terms of a prioritisation list will be different between each service director, and you risk making suboptimal decisions based on that because you're looking at comparing numbers which probably aren't comparable. I'm relatively fortunate in terms of my directorate in terms of on an ongoing basis there aren't any significant delivery risks. I had quite a lot this year in terms of some projects have been going on my directorate, but going forward, less so, and therefore there's very few proposals for investment for resources. If I had one, it would therefore be a prioritisation of one. Does that make it more important than some the priority number 4 for housing, environmental health, where there are many issues? So I think purely putting numbers in it's probably not the right approach for it, but certainly put me something around a bit more commentary and look at sort of talking subjects for how we do that to kind of a bit more substance around those implications, which really come out of the budget workshops. But yeah, writing it down might be more helpful in terms of that discussion at council.
Could I just? No, I completely agree. I mean, the budget workshops took place in November. Obviously, by the time we go from November to the end of February, a significant amount of time has elapsed. Many matters have been discussed by councillors in a whole host of different committees. So I think it would definitely help and inform the debate on what we're going to be discussing. So I'd very much appreciate that.
Any further questions from the committee? If not, oh, sorry, John Cannon, sorry.
At the risk of just stringing the point out, I like the conversation around prioritisation, so thanks for sticking with it. Would it be an oversimplification to say that the degree of risk associated with each proposal is simply the value of the spend? Or are there other financial implications that need to be brought to Cabinet's attention more specifically? Source of funding or duration of the spending, the long-term commitment that's being made. You can end up paralysed by analysis, but there are drivers of risk within here which don't leap off the page unless you're familiar with the topic.
Yeah, we do try and put that in the report. So, you will tend to probably not being as many examples this year as some years, but you will see where the capital bid. We'll try and align that with any revenue implications of that to make sure the kind of complete picture is there, albeit there's kind of separate papers and separate reports, but understand that the complete picture by providing that linkage back is helpful in that respect. In terms of the duration, we've obviously got the 5-year projection there. And, to a degree, I look at two things. I'm looking at the, say, investment proposals. I'm looking at what is the immediate sort of short-term impact over 1, 2 or 3 years, and the total amount there, is that affordable? But then the second bit I look at is that year 5 column. If I project that year 5 column forward, what's the ongoing impact of that? And that's probably my bigger focus, because actually my concern at the moment is not, given the state of our reserves, not around what can we do in the short term. It's around what's that 5-year funding gap going forward. So my focus always jumps to that 5th column and go, assume that happens every year ongoing. That's my biggest issue. So if you've got £100,000, £50,000 in zeros, that has a lower concern to me in some ways than £20,000 every year across the 5 years, because I can see that £20,000 going on forever.
Any further questions at all? If not, the recommendations are that the Finance, Audit and Risk Committee comment on the recommendations to Cabinet, which are 2.1, that Cabinet notes the Council's expected funding for 2025-26, 2.2, that Cabinet confirms, in line with the medium-term financial strategy, that budget forecast should be based on increasing council tax by 2.99%, the maximum amount allowable without a local referendum, noting that government have assumed council tax will increase by the maximum amount allowed in calculating core spending power. 2.3, that Cabinet notes that the council may see real-term reductions in its funding in future years. 2.4. That, in the context of the above, Cabinet agree which proposals, revenue and capital, should be taken forward as part of the budget setting process for 2025-26. Can I please have a proposer? Councillor Pooper Singham, thank you. And a seconder. Oh, Councillor Brown, thank you. We'll now move on to the debate. Anything for the committee at all? Councillor Munter.
I certainly think that Councillor Albert will pass on the comments of which have been made by this committee. And certainly I look forward to discussing these proposals in depth at Council come late February.
I'm sure he'll be ready to hear it when they come forward. If there's no further debate, then can we move to the vote, please, on the recommendations?
Thank you, Chair. That motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 8, which is the report on risk management governance mid-year update. Hand over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. So you get this report committee twice per year, with the idea being that it allows you to have an oversight of how we're managing risk in the council. You may remember that a while ago, we moved kind of the actual risk monitoring in terms of projects to Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So part of the bit where you're not looking at stuff that you're then marking. So this is looking at how the risk management process is operating. In line with the recommendations that came out of the audit reports, have, in terms of the second paragraph of the executive summary, tried to capture the particular bits around where risks have moved, and some of the kind of key highlights in there to come provide that kind of high-level overview to help with the report. The other thing that is changed from previous versions of this report is that, I'll just find the right paragraph, in paragraph 8.2.6 on page 57 of the report pack, we have now got, for the highest risk areas, so the highest of the corporate risk, those that are rated as red, a list of the work completed and the ongoing work as recorded on IdeaGem. It's the first time we've done it in that format. And what I propose is that we'll use this, particularly moving forward to these reviews going forward. We'll start to try and track which of those work completed things have moved into which the ongoing work has moved to work completed, and then trying to track how that then impacts on the risk score. We do tend to have quite a few, what I will term in a non-technical way, sticky risks. The risk score does tend to stick at a certain level and doesn't move very much, despite the fact there is work going on in relation to those risks to try and mitigate them where possible, particularly on the projects. And therefore, I guess having that kind of additional input into what's going on in the background on those kind of measures to address those risks will provide some reassurance that the stuff is happening. It's just not having the impact yet expected on the risk score. There is a tendency with project-based risks is that until the project is completed, there is a concern that the risk could still come up, and therefore the risk score tends to remain quite high throughout the duration of the project, and then will suddenly drop off at the end when it's completed. Do get a little bit of reduction as time. Some of the key actions do happen, but there's always that concern. And the other thing to say on our three overarching risks, which are cyber, financial, and resourcing risk, there are factors outside of their control that generally mean that those risk scores are staying high. So in relation to in relation to financial risk, we are, as you know, still waiting for that medium-term settlement from government as to what our funding will be. Which means there's still an element of risk around how much money we'll even have. And then there's the risk on top of that around how we then react to that, which means that until the kind of either of those have happened, you can't really sort of see the risk score coming down until we've got to that point. And then you can then see hopefully a plan be developed, which then helps bring that risk score down, albeit until it's delivered. You've still got savings to be delivered, and therefore there'll be still risk attached to delivery of those. Similarly, in relation to the resourcing risk, that risk is there because we can't afford the level of staffing that would make sure that we could deliver all the projects we want to deliver, and we could pay enough so we can fill all the posts we want to fill. So until that's resolved, which may never be the case, ultimately that position where there's a high risk there. And then cyber risk, whatever we do, there will be people out there who are trying to cyber attack organizations, including us, and that risk will never go away. And there is always a risk, and probably a high risk, that one of those will be successful, and therefore the implications of that could be really huge, and therefore it always stay high risk, despite the fact the myriad of action we're taking, and we're doing a really good job in relation to that. That risk is still there. So that's kind of what hopefully that over time we'll see from that bit of the report. And as is referenced elsewhere in the report, like in paragraph section 8.3, risk reviews are taking place, but you will sort of see, I guess, that risks are, as I said, sort of quite sticky. They do tend to get stuck at the same sort of score. It also covers changing risks in terms of new risks, archive risks, and also in sections 9 and 10 and 11 provide some sort of things that are linked to risk, some areas of activity linked to risk, and sort of commentary on those. And then we've got actions from the annual report for 2024-25 and the progress against those. So just noting those, and I think they're all making progress against all of those, so it's positive. And we'll continue to monitor that throughout the year and into the end of year report for 25 for this end of this current year. So that's my introduction to the report. Obviously, lots of detail in there. So if there's any question, any detail on it, we can try and dig into that.
Thank you. Councillor Munster.
Thank you, Chair. And please accept my apologies, Ian, if this was covered either in the training or in the report. But would you just be able to jog my memory as to the relationship between this and the risk register?
So all the information in here in terms of the risks comes from the risk register. So what it presents to this committee is all of the corporate risks, and trying to provide a summary of the information from that to give assurance over the fact that risk reviews are taking place and that risk reviews are effective, and that there are a process in place to kind of identify new risks and archive risks when necessary. I am not going to sit here and say we're perfect on all of that. We do carry out reviews, and they do look in detail about what's going on, but there's always scope to do more, albeit it's all about capacity and time. And yeah, there is always scope to do more around identifying new risks. With project risks, it's good in terms of when a project starts. We will look at a project and look at what the risks are going to be and note those down and carry that process. For that kind of other things that could come and hit us kind of risks, it's a bit more bit too reactionary in terms of we wait until it's almost going to happen before we put it on the risk register. So there's something to learn there and something we get better at. But all the information on here is derived from that risk register, which provides a huge amount of information that more like a possibly written this report. But as I advertised many, many times, you're welcome to use the guest login and go into that database and look at everything you want. You can't break it. Just click on stuff to your heart's content. It all kind of works in a tree structure. You start at the top and you can sort of dig it down into whatever you want to dig into, and you'll find lots of exciting information in there.
Will I just be able to come back on that with respect to reviewing of risk? And you and I were in Kimpton yesterday. We obviously are very aware of the issue and the threat which groundwater poses to the village. With respect to keeping that risk under review, what institution, what structure, working group, etc., is used in order to keep that specific risk under review, and then that filling in or filtering into it on the risk register? Is it the multi-agency meetings, or is there a separate group within the council that considers that risk and the council's response?
And this is part of the reason we put emergency planning as a separate item on these reports, because emergency planning sort of sits a bit outside this, because I mean, Kipton's a bit of a different example. So a lot of emergency planning is that there's always a risk of Kipton happening, because of just the situation about where it is and the groundwater, and it's always there. But if you look at risk emergency planning more generally, there is always a risk of a bad event happening that requires kind of an emergency response. But you just don't know where it's going to be or when it's going to be. And so there's not a risk register for every single potential emergency planning incident that might happen, but we have very stringent and very detailed emergency planning kind of guidance and processes that we follow as and when we need to enact those for any particular instance. And then when incidents do occur, it then becomes the responsibility of the incident manager and the multi-agency group, if called for, to then look at those risks and assess those on a, basically an ongoing basis, on a very dynamic ongoing basis, to kind of keep those under control and think about what's the best thing we can do to try and mitigate the impact on residents and help them recover from those incidents. So emergency planning is a bit different in terms of these other risks, but there is still a big, very strong process there, and that's why it's referred to in the report.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee at all? John Cannon.
Please, just a point of clarification, please. The paper mentions strategic risks and service risks, and then corporate risks with a capital C and a capital R. Are those terms synonymous? Can you just explain for me which of these risks are the corporate risks?
So this report focuses just on the corporate or strategic risks. We should just use the same term for both. So I apologise. They should be called corporate risks. That's what we refer to in our risk guidance documents. And yes, we just focus on the corporate risks in this report. The idea gen system does have all our risks on it, including our service risks, but for allowing you as a committee to have some focus on some level of kind of detail of what's going on, we just focus on the corporate risks in this respect.
Thank you. Just one question for myself, thinking about the process elements and the sort of how things are managed. Obviously, we've referred in a previous item to the training received by the committee in terms of the fact that we are upskilling as much as we can be. From an officer perspective, obviously, given that the risk policy applies to all those who work for the council, whether officers or councillors, do you have a fairly robust training program there to make sure that all staff are able to sort of input in their own roles as to feeding things through and ensuring that they're able to make their voice heard in terms of picking stuff up day to day as well as the larger items?
Yes, so we have e-learning available to all officers, and with the focus being on risk managers, those service managers based in the organisation who are more likely to be kind of dealing with risk management, and we also do semi-regular sessions with that senior manager group around risk and horizon scanning and those kind of things to kind of help with that kind of general view of it. And we also have a very good risk officer who will go out and provide both individual training and individual guidance to officers when undertaking risk reviews and going through that risk management process.
Thank you. If there's no further questions from the committee, then the recommendations are 2.1, that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee note and provide recommendations to Cabinet on this mid-year risk management governance update. 2.2, that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee comment on the changes to the risk management framework and recommend to Cabinet that they approve the changes. Could I please have a proposer? Councillor Griffiths, thank you. And a seconder, Councillor Pooper-Singham, thank you very much. We'll now move on to the debate. Is there any debate from the committee at all? Councillor Brown.
Just speaking to recommendation 2.2 about commenting on the changes, I just wanted to say I think it's welcome that the e-learning is now mandatory for managers, and also the training that we received, it's not specifically referred to in here, but that we received prior to this meeting was really, really helpful as well. I think the report is very clear. I like the framework and the matrices. I think they work very well. And then the more detailed table about the work completed, ongoing work is also extremely helpful. So thank you very much for your report, and I personally am happy to approve it.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. If there's no further debate from the committee, then could we please move to the vote on the recommendations, please?
Chair, that motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you very much. Before we moved on to the next agenda item, just to check if any members would prefer to have a very short rest break now, or if we want to carry on and with the agenda as it is. Yep, sure. Well, if we pause now just for 5 minutes, we're back at about 5 to 9, if possible, that'd be brilliant. Thank you very much. Has everyone had a chance to grab drinks and things? Councillor Albert, if you could stop distracting members of the committee, that'd be very appreciated. Oh, don't worry. Right. We shall now move on to item 9, Q2 revenue budget monitoring 2024-25. Hand over to Ian Cooper to present.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I will start the recommendations and reiterate that this is the chance for the committee to comment, I guess, on the process around budget monitoring rather than the detail around the decisions being made in relation to any policy decisions around money's being spent on. This report follows a very standard format, so those who've seen it before will be very used to what it shows. It starts off by giving a background as to where the budget has got to throughout the year, and the evolution of the budget over the year, and then describes in 8.1 any variances, i.e. differences between planned spend, budgeted spend and actual spend forecast for the year, and the implications of those, with explanations against each of those where they're over £25,000. She's going to give the reasons for that, and then seeking, I guess, for cabinet approval that is all okay. Overall, that table shows a net reduction in spend for this year of £550,000. I would note that some of that is just storing up spend for next year, as the requests are there are for £317,000 of carry forwards. So the net is the kind of the difference between the real underspend rather than just delayed due to available resources or not being able to do it at this time, or in terms of prioritisation. In terms of process, we do in the following paragraphs keep a track of the savings that were due to be delivered and how well we're doing at achieving those, because sometimes they can get netted off and you don't notice them. So we do go a very detailed bit around that. And then we've got the financial health indicators in relation to our income in paragraphs 8.6 and 8.7, and looking at the trend on those and to whether they're being delivered, and then the reasons for that, and then the backing information on those. And then we dive into the sort of last section of the report, which looks at our general fund balance overall and the forecast there. In general, that is driven mainly by our net expenditure, but during the year we do keep a track of where we're going with our collection fund, and forecast of funding in year on those, and also ongoing. Generally, the impact of variation in collection fund, which is the amounts of business rates and council tax we collect, both for us and on behalf of other bodies as well, is the impact of those generally delayed by a year. So we've got a commentary around that, and then the impact in year on those where applicable. And then the last bit is around our financial risks. So harking back to a comment made earlier about what our general fund balance should be and that kind of guidance on minimum level. Part of that is assessing the risk of various things happening. And this keeps a track of that, see whether that's kind of was an accurate estimate in terms of that. So if that number there in table 8 goes negative, that means that the risk assessment wasn't good enough. We didn't make enough assessment for risk. If it stays positive, then that's probably a good sign in terms of we're there or thereabouts in terms of reflecting all the risks that could happen and attracting a fairly prudent assessment against those. And then paragraphs 8.1.6 and 8.17 are an addition for this report for this time. It's got a couple of debt write-offs that we're asking Cabinet to approve, and the reasons for those given the report. As stated there, the implications of those are already reflected in the budget monitoring, such as those being approved. So that's kind of an outline of the report. Have to take any questions or any comments on the report.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I've got two questions. Firstly, are the underspends within the expected and acceptable limits in your view? And secondly, are there any limitations on carrying forward the underspend, for example, where there are government grants where there might be criteria about when the spending has to be, when the money has to be spent. I was particularly wondering about the EV charging points because I thought that was the subject of a government grant. So I just wonder, so that's a bit more detailed question, but in broad terms, is this what you'd expect within acceptable limits for an underspend?
It's difficult to answer that in terms of what would be an acceptable unspend. I mean, the most important bit is, do the explanations make sense? It's very easy to unspend money by not doing anything. But we obviously want to do stuff and deliver services. So it's important we don't just spend no money at all. So the explanation is the key bit there. We, I guess, do generally underspend against our budget. The biggest variation this year is the exceptional about interest rates being higher and therefore the additional investment returns, which is fine. You know, that's a good thing. But there will be examples in here where it's around capacity, around delivery of projects, and that's obviously sometimes necessary, but not so a good thing in the same way as that investment return income being higher than expected. So I would always encourage Cabinet, and therefore you, kind of looking at the government side of it, is to focus on the explanations and do those make sense, and do those seem reasonable in relation to those. We would always flag where there is an issue in terms of carry forwards and government grant money or any restricted grant money, and say that, you know, if it is going to have a return back, we would flag that and say, don't, you can't go forward because we have to go back to the person that gave it to us if we don't spend it. So that would always be flagged in the report, rather than just allowing to carry forward and then sort of ending up carrying forward and not then having to give it back, which would be a bad thing, because it was best to spend the money rather than have to give it back to someone.
Any further questions from the committee at all? If none, then the recommendations are that the committee comment on the recommendations to Cabinet, which are 2.1, that Cabinet notes this report, 2.2, that Cabinet approves the changes to the 2024-25 General Fund budget as identified in Table 3 and paragraph 8.2, a £550,000 decrease in net expenditure. 2.3, that Cabinet notes the changes to the 2025-26 General Fund budget as identified in Table 3 and paragraph 8.2, a total £306,000 increase in net expenditure. These will be incorporated in the draft revenue budget for 2025-26. 2.4, that Cabinet approve the debt write-offs detailed in paragraphs 8.16 and 8.17. Can I please have a proposer? Councillor Pupler-Singham, thank you. And a seconder. Councillor Brown, I think you just won out on that one. Apologies, Councillor Willoughby. We'll now move on to the debate. Is there any debate at all from the committee? I think the only thing I was going to probably mention in relation to Councillor Brown's point from before is that looking through, there are a number of the carryovers and reductions in spend that do seem to relate to the staffing issue, which I suppose, again, being the highlighted, well, one of the highlighted key risks we previously looked at, does suggest, I suppose, that it's, you know, although probably good on paper in terms of a reduction in spending, I think probably getting to the point you were probably looking at, it's probably not a great thing overall. You know, it's an outcome, I suppose, of the situation we find ourselves in terms of trying to not just bring in new staff, but retain staff as well to deliver our services. And I know, Ian, you've pretty much raised this at every meeting we've had over the last 2 years, it being a key risk. And I suppose, again, it's just hoping that, you know, the work on mitigating that can bear fruit in the future. Again, obviously, not spending huge amounts of money can be good, and, you know, balancing the budget is a positive thing. But clearly, if that's coming at expense of delivering services, then, you know, I suppose it's the negative side of that, which is that things don't happen on that basis. I think that's all I've got to add on the budget at this point, monitoring at this point. Any further comment? Councillor Brown.
Just to agree with that, and just to add to that, that it's disappointing when projects get delayed, and often that is because of resourcing issues.
Anything further from the committee at all? If not, could we please move on to the vote on the recommendations?
Thank you, Chair. That's carried unanimously.
Thank you very much. Now move on to item 10, which is the Q2 Investment Strategy, Capital and Treasury Review 2024-25. For the final time tonight, hand over to Ian Cooper to present the item.
And for the third and final time, I will start with my introduction to the report, looking at recommendations and saying that it's about the process you're looking at here, just to kind of make that point again. We get bored of it, won't you? So, yeah, looking at the process, this is the capital and treasury strategy, combined with the investment strategy. So it starts off by looking at the capital spend for the year. We've had a real try and push on getting in early with any capital slippage, i.e. capital projects that are going to be delayed until next year. So really trying to push that at this quarter and get the focus on those. So that is why we have got huge numbers in this report, because we have really looked to try and do that this quarter, rather than usually kind of drifted in quarter 3 or quarter 4. So that's why the numbers are big. Hopefully this is going to give a realistic forecast for the end of the year. I still suspect there'll be a bit more slippage by the end of the year. By a very nature, managers like to hold on to their budgets rather than so they're not going to spend them too early. So there is probably a bit more of that to come out, but I think we're a lot closer to where I think we'll be at the end of the year than we have been in other years at quarter 2 in terms of those projections. And, you know, again, looking at the reasons for difference column is the key bit here in table 2 around why those amounts are slipping. And there's generally bigger reasons for them. This time it's not all about resources, although some of it is due to resources in terms of delivery of those projects. I would also quickly flag, and this is not a definite yet, but on the museum and commercial storage, there is the possibility that could move a bit quicker in terms of if we are looking at an alternative other than redeveloping the current sites. There may be some options sooner than the end of the year in which there will be some spend that could be incurred. We'll update cabinet next week if there's a potential for that, which could mean actually slip less of that budget into next year for now, because there may be an option to look at an alternative site as the estates team are looking at. So, you know, that could actually be overestimated in terms of slippage. No, less slippage than actually forecast on that one. Apart from that, you know, it sets out against each one why the need is to delay them, or in some cases not spend them at all, and then sets out the conclusion at the end, which is that we will look to have a reduction, by the time we scroll through all the many pages of the various explanations, of 14 million reduction in budget for this year, but a 14 million increase in budget in future years from table 2. And then table 3 is the ones where we have got actual variations, or you're not going to spend them at all, or going to spend less or spend more than was currently forecast. And that's a reduction in spend of 1.362 million. So that's a genuine reduction in actual spend at this stage. There is also the prospect for some of those that there may be a need later on, particularly on some of the capital maintenance ones, maybe this need later on, but not for some time. So we're delaying them out of there. Overall, that means that currently we are still forecasting we'll need to borrow a little bit this year to fund our capital program. It is possible that that will come down to more towards 0 if we do get a bit more slippage by the end of the year, and actually we can fund all of those capital projects this year from our capital reserves. But noting that as we move into next year, we will be in a position whereby we will be required to borrow to fund our capital program. As I have said previously, that will be internal borrowing initially, whereby we use our cash reserves to borrow against rather than going out to the external market for borrowing. But if we do have to borrow this year, that does then mean we will be required to charge a minimum revenue provision next year against the budget, which the general fund hit in that year. the longer we can kind of avoid borrowing, the longer we delay that additional revenue hit in our budget, albeit is forecast in the budget forecasts for the year. Noting in paragraph 8.9 that there are a couple of things where we're looking to bring the spend forward. So still plans to spend the money next year, but not currently capital program, but needing confirmation of that earlier to bring it forward from some later years into next year, because that means we can sort of schedule it alongside the decarbonisation work at the Leisure Centre. So that covers that. Again, it could be based on latest estimates. We need to increase the budget slightly for some of that, but again, we'll report back to Cabinet for those about whether that still makes sense. But yeah, these are, the flume is part of the offer at North Arch Leisure Centre. It is an integral part of that. And the Change Village at North Arch Leisure Centre does need doing. And part of the fact we can generate income from our leisure centres is the fact we do invest in them and maintain them up to a decent standard. So if it is going to cost a bit more, probably is necessary to achieve that outcome. The second part of the report focuses on our treasury management. At the moment, you'll see in 8.12, in terms of interest rates available, local authorities are paying far higher than anywhere else, albeit that all interest rates are higher than they have been. Well, they're coming down from where they were for peak, but they are still higher than they have been in sort of the relatively recent past. So we're still looking at kind of interest rates as set out in the table in paragraph 8.1.3, where you're looking at kind of interest rates around the 5% mark. But some of those are a bit lower, but that sort of order, and that table lists out all the investors who've got outstanding at the end of that quarter in relation to those. So that's the report and a brief run through about what it covers. Again, any questions or comments?
Thank you. Councillor Munster.
Thank you, Chair. Just with respect to the decarbonisation project and recommendation 2.4, obviously, as we've discussed previously tonight, we're still going to be awaiting Cabinet's decision next week. But with respect to the estimates and the budget forecasts, how long do we anticipate it to take for modelling to take place to better understand the impact of Cabinet's decision? So two of the options are not to proceed with decarbonisation works at North Herts Leisure Centre. Will those models, will those estimates be ready, do you think, by late February when we are going to discuss these at council?
It would certainly be my intention to have those ready by that point. Yes, so we'll push depending on what decisions are made, we'll push the various contractors and consultants around what the implications of those are, so we can fully build that into the budget forecasts.
I was going to ask a quick question. It relates to a specific item on here around Orton Head Common Weir. Is that the environmental agency bit there? Is that around the statutory consultees on that piece? And again, there's a more general one then. Are there any other areas where we have outside bodies that might be delaying that rather than making decisions internally to hold off for reasons of, making decisions and wishing to do works at different times?
That's the only one I can recall from the long list about ones where it's kind of an external party. But if anyone else spots any more with a comments reference an external party being involved, then please shout and I will correct my comment there. But yeah, I don't have much more information to what I've written there in terms of, yes, it's the fact that they want more work done on it. I think there is also a better time of year to do that kind of stuff from what I remember. And therefore, once you delay by a certain point, you then have to wait till the next period in that year. I'm going to presume it's summer, but I'm not going to guarantee commit to that. But yeah, there will be, I guess, times of years to do that kind of work, and it's better than others.
Thank you. John Cannon.
Thank you. Couple of questions, please. The museum and commercial storage piece is a big number. An options paper was presented to Cabinet. Curious about what the options were. And you mentioned that there was one around an alternative site. Was that the only one? I'm just wondering if there was any option to even remove this level of spend by treating the collection differently. Not that I know the contents of the collection.
It was a very, very detailed report, quite long in terms of the options presented, and it was considered by scrutiny as well as that report. Brief some of the options, it ranged from basically keep going with the building we've got already and accept that the collection, i.e. the items in that storage, would gradually degrade over time, through to rebuilding on site a new purpose-built museum storage facility on site, and then looking at alternatives for off-site. So looking at developing storage somewhere else, either an existing building or a new building somewhere else, in partnership with other people, with funding from other sources if possible, and looking at all those options and the pros and cons of each one. Cabinet set out some options they wish to discount and some to proceed with. I guess the core thrust of the option was that we want to do something to house the collection in suitable conditions on an ongoing basis, and accept that comes with a substantial cost. But the instruction cabinet was to look at various options around building on site through to looking at other properties. And what I alluded to earlier was there might be a potential for an existing site in Letchworth that could be adapted. So looking at the cost of that compared with a new build. Obviously, it's not just a case of finding a warehouse and chucking the exhibits in there. If you're going to keep them properly, you need some kind of temperature, climate controls, at least for some of the items. And I'm sure the museum team can give you a long list about which ones require what type of conditions. But if you're looking at an existing building, you're looking at some investment to make it suitable for those purposes. And on top of that, looking at, with climate change and our agenda there, looking at how you make it a kind of a climate change, a suitable venue into a suitable heating system or cooling system that is reliant on non-carbon usage rather than on gas. So all that needs to be factored into the equation around whether it's worth progressing those options, which is why the direction of travel is really useful in cabinet, but now we should go away and look at the detail around how we actually look at what's actually possible.
Thank you. John?
Just to follow it through, has an option been considered not to store the collection, but to put it on permanent display and make it a community asset that might draw crowds and income? With a view to a big number in here. I'm not partisan about it in any respect. It's just looking to manage the number.
I think the issue is there's a lot of stuff in there, and the cost of finding somewhere to put on permanent display would be astronomical in terms of the building that would be required. It is not a case of the fact that we're just choosing not to put it in North Arts Museum just to keep, because if it fitted there, we probably would put it in there and display a lot of it. But there's huge amounts of stuff in there, and it's linked to our museum accreditation and preserving the history of the district to do something with it. And the ideal is that having a better storage facility as well as preserving it does allow some access to those exhibits from those who are, I guess, more interested in some of the more detailed aspects of the district's history. Obviously in the museum itself, we put the more stuff with biggest broad interest to residents and those visiting the museum, but there is stuff in our storage which is, for those doing more in-depth studies, would be more interesting, and the idea would be that it's more accessible for that kind of use going forward. Albeit, that does affect the overall cost, and both in terms of the facility itself and also any staffing that we link to that.
I think on that one as well, just off the top of my head, I remember from one of the discussions we had that we, as North Arts Council, have been made responsible for the plant and seed collection for the entirety of Hertfordshire as well. I think there's a few elements like that which we are essentially responsible for wider collections than just our own. So part of the consideration is obviously protecting items which have been granted to us on behalf of others. So it's it's been quite a convoluted process, I think, up to this point, in terms of understanding how we deal with those. And I think the accreditation part as well has been a factor in driving a decision to make sure there is some replacement on that side. But one of the 4 members of this committee, who is now the exec member responsible, used to bring it pretty much every meeting in terms of making sure the funding was still in place. So I believe she would be, so as she has done, happy to take people around the site again currently. So many members have been taken through on cold days. You can feel the wind coming through the walls and things. So yeah, I think there's a number of factors on that front which have sort of driven in that replacement direction. Councillor Munzer.
Forgive me, just on the museum storage project, my understanding was the report of which was presented to both this committee, overview and scrutiny, and then to Cabinet, was one of rationalising the available options and then putting more resource, more energy and investment into looking at, a more feasible and viable solution. So am I right in thinking that once that process has happened, it will go through the same process of going to ONS, coming to FAR, to Cabinet, and then because of the value of that decision, any budgetary implications will then be dealt with by Council, and that will be the layer of scrutiny?
So yes, it will go back to both ONS and Cabinet, probably not so far. It's a policy decision rather than there's looking at kind of back to our core audit committee governance side of it, probably isn't a far consideration, that one. Whether it goes back to full council will depend on any individual aspect, and the value of it is obviously needs to go into capital programme. So part of that will be through that route. If it involves an acquisition of property above 2.5 million, that is a full council decision. There obviously could be scope on some of the options around acquiring property that costs less than 2.5 million. That then becomes a cabinet decision to acquire such property, and with ONS considering it as well. And you could have a scenario where I guess you could have an acquisition of property below that threshold and then works on top of that. That point then doesn't need to go back to council unless the overall capital threshold overall is above the limits already set out within the capital budget, to be agreed as part of the budget, to be agreed or reconfirmed as part of the 25-26 budget setting process.
Councillor Bartos.
Thank you. Just looking at the some of the reasons for difference in the figures, I'm looking at Norton Common tennis courts. The reason there seems to be pretty vague in terms of, so it says due to difficulty in obtaining a sufficient number of quotations. Is that to do with us internally or to do with other bodies externally that we haven't been able to do that?
So it's a combination. I'm just trying to interpret what's written there as well. So we do have a procurement process we have to follow, and depending on the value of the work involved will depend on how many quotes we need in terms of or procurement processing to go through. So if the original estimate was 25,000, that would be one particular procurement route we'd have to go through. It looks like when we've gone through that route, the quotes have come in. It's been difficult to get in the right number, just to kind of challenge the kind of the different numbers coming back in terms of cost. And then they've come back at a higher cost than that. So then they're probably into a different procurement process need to follow then to justify our procurement rules. So kind of a bit of a delay in terms of both factors of it, in terms of getting the quotes initially. They come in higher, which then requires a different procurement route to be followed. And that then causes another bit delay. So I guess a bit kind of conspired against us a little bit in terms of trying to get that done. But the whole reason for procurement rules is to make sure we're getting paid for money. So that is important that as the cost goes up, we challenge and have process in place to make sure we're still getting the value for money out of that process.
Any further questions to the committee? If not, the recommendation that Finance, Audit and Risk Committee provides comments on the recommendations to Cabinet, which are 2.1, that Cabinet notes the forecast expenditure of £15.699 million in 2024-25 on the capital programme, paragraph 8.3 refers. 2.2, that Cabinet notes the position of the availability of capital resources as detailed in Table 4, paragraph 8.6, and the requirement to keep the capital programme under review for affordability. 2.3, that Cabinet recommends to Council that it notes the position of Treasury management activity as at the end of September 2024. 2.4, that Cabinet recommends to Council that it approves capital budgets in 2025-26 for a new flume, £300,000, and a refurbishment of the pool changing rooms, £250,000, at North Herts Leisure Centre. Could I please have a proposer? Councillor Pooper-Singham, thank you. And a seconder, Councillor Griffiths, thank you. We'll now move on to debates. Councillor Munster.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to propose an amendment to recommendation 2.4, with that amendment reading subject to revised assessments following the decision taken by Cabinet on 14th of January 2025. I think that it just builds resilience into the recommendations to Council, because obviously this is a very fast moving situation and one of which, you know, we need to be acutely aware of.
Councillor Brown.
I'm happy to second that amendment.
Two seconds. I don't think I've had an amendment to one of the recommendations previously on the committee, so I'm just going to have a quick check. Anything from you, Ian, at all?
I guess the key bit is around being a bit precise about what the decision you're referring to, because obviously this is also going to that meeting. So I guess it's a bit clear, probably around decisions made in relation to the public sector decarbonisation scheme reports would be more precise around making sure that that reflects that, because it could refer to any decision if you don't be that precise. Haven't checked the cabinet agenda order yet, but I'm sure we're going to consider the PSDS item before this item. These items tend to go towards the end of the agenda. So I think we will make sure we do that item first, and then at that meeting itself, we can then reflect what the outcome of that's been in terms of how that impacts on this one.
Could I, oh, forgive me, sorry.
Just on that, sorry, Ralph, that I think from my memory of the cabinet agenda at the moment, the PSDS is the very last item on the agenda. It was tacked on, I assume, but that doesn't mean that that's how it'll be debated. But at the moment, the agenda shows it's the last item of the cabinet agenda.
Thank you, Councillor Albert. Councillor Munster, are you happy with the wording suggested by Ian Cooper in terms of the extra wording, or do you wish to stick with what you had previously?
No, would you just be able to reconfirm that? Because I would have said subject to the revised assessments following decision taken by Cabinet regarding the public sector decarbonisation scheme on the 14th of January. But I'm more than happy to defer to your council.
With that extra information, that sounds fine in terms of that specifies what it relates to.
Councillor Munster, can I ask if I could come and grab the bit of paper you've written that down on, so I can? Oh, sorry. I think I think James has got it now as well, so we should be all right. Thank you for that. Right, we've solved that one, so thank you very much to James there. Councillor Brown.
Just for completeness, I'm happy with that change in the amendment. I think it's important to specify that we're talking about the public sector decarbonisation scheme.
Thank you both there. Just for in terms of the procedure at this point, do we need as a committee to vote on the amendment now before moving back to debate? Yes. Thank you very much. Oh. Right. So while we're doing that piece, is there any debate from the committee on the amendment that's been proposed? Doesn't appear to be. Councillor Singham, sorry.
Again, just for my clarification, what exactly is it that Councillor Munster wants? Or would like, sorry, not wants. What would you like?
With your permission, Chair, shall I read out the proposed recommendation as amended?
That would probably be very helpful at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're looking at 2.4, that Cabinet recommends to Council that it approves capital budgets for 2025-26 for a new flume and a refurbishment of the pool changing rooms at North Herts Leisure Centre, subject to revised assessments following the decision taken by Cabinet regarding the public sector decarbonisation scheme on the 14th of January 2025. And the reasons being is that it just builds resilience into the recommendation to Council, as obviously this is a fluid situation.
And to confirm that this is on the basis that the reason that the funding's been moved is because if that work is undertaken at that point, the work is all undertaken in one go, and therefore if the decarbonisation effort goes ahead, you then get all the disruption out of the way in one go, and that's the original reason for the proposal for moving that funding. And therefore, if they don't accept doing the work as they're expecting to, there's no point moving the other money to do the work then.
There, within the recommendation, within the report, there are 4 different options, 2 of which are that North Herts Leisure Centre doesn't engage in or isn't in receipt of the public sector decarbonisation scheme, and therefore there could potentially be a cost implication. So it's about making sure that we're fully aware of the costs involved as well as the risks.
Councillor Singham.
Yeah, no, maybe that last point from Council wants to clarify. So the assessment that you're looking for is what, and coming from whom and being presented to whom?
So with respect to the assessment, we got confirmation from Ian that subject to Cabinet's decision, there will be consultants will be engaged, and please feel free to correct me if I'm misquoting you, Ian, and to give us a better idea as to the cost implications and the risks involved with the project. And once we're in receipt of that and we better understand the cost implications, then they can be presented to Council as per the recommendation. On the PSGS, yes. Is there any point of clarification that I can help you with to better understand it?
I'm not sure it adds anything beyond what Cabinet's going to be doing, does it?
I think the issue with the recommendation as it currently stands is that it is allocating £300,000 for a new flume, £250,000 for the pool changing rooms. Now, that is based on the assumption that the PSGS will take place. If it doesn't take place, those costs could change. It could obviously increase in cost or it could decrease in cost, and therefore it builds resilience to ensure that, you know, the recommendation of which is proposed to Council on in late February is more accurate as to the situation of which Council agrees. Cabinet agrees, forgive me.
Councillor Brown.
I don't want to confuse anybody further, but I felt that the chair explained this quite well. So in 8.9, the reason for moving this capital expenditure forward is so that the works could be completed at the same time. If the works for the decarbonisation don't go ahead, then there's no reason to move these works forward, this capital forward. So hence why there's that recommendation has to be subject to the cabinet decision.
And Councillor Albert.
Yeah, I think Ralph's right in terms of actually putting this, and Ruth in putting this additional point in, because certainly in any of the conversations I've had so far on this, I don't think we've discussed what we would do about the flume, and this other brought forward work, which is already in the budget. But it was just going to be brought forward, as colleagues have said, to actually time it with alongside the decarbonisation work. But what we haven't done is had a discussion. Is if we did choose not to go ahead with the North Herts part and the Hitchin part and only the Royston part or something, which are part of the options, then we would then need to actually have a discussion as to what to do about and when to do the flume and those elements of the work that would have been done with the decarbonisation. So I think that I get the point, and I'm happy that we should take that on board.
Okay, so on that basis, then we'll move on to the vote on the amendment. So this is for the original recommendation 2.4 with the additional text that reads, subject to the revised assessments following the decision by Cabinet regarding PSDS on 14th of January 2025. Could we please move to the vote?
Thank you, Chair. That amendment is carried unanimously.
When we do vote on the recommendations, it will be with the amended 2.4 included. So we'll now move back to the debate on the recommendations themselves. Is there any further debate at all from the committee? Nothing's coming forward. So in which case then, could we please move to vote on the recommendations?
Thank you, Chair. That's carried as amended.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 11, which is possible agenda items for future meetings. So it's our usual final standing item for the committee. For any committee members who wish to raise items they would like to see on future agendas, or any comments in terms of existing items which they would like to see differently. If there are any recommendations or suggestions, please put them forward at this point. If not, again, either to myself, Councillor Pupler-Singham and Ian Cooper in other times, and we can consider those for future items. Can't see anything. So in which case, thank you again to the committee members and subs for being here tonight. Thank you, Ian, for holding the fort on all items that have been presented and all the questions that have come forward again. It's very appreciated. The next meeting of Finance, Audit and Risk Committee will be on Wednesday, the 5th of February, 2025. And I'll bring this meeting to a close at 9:40. Thank you, everyone.